Hi everybody, welcome to Unit 2 of the Money Matters Social Studies textbook for Foundation class. In Unit 2, we're looking at the Great Depression. So we finished looking at how the economy was growing and growing and growing, and suddenly the economy started to go down. And that's what the Great Depression was, the American economy collapsing. So today we're looking at the long-term causes. Remember I said yesterday, things can happen over a long period of time or a very short period of time. And the causes mean the reason for something to happen. So let's have a look today at the long-term causes. Before you watch this video though, look at the YouTube video that I put into Facebook. This is an overview of the whole of the Great Depression and the recovery. You might need to slow the pace down a little bit. I know they speak very quickly, but go and watch that first, and that will give you the big idea of everything that we're going to study for the next few weeks. So during the 1920s, the economy seemed to be strong and healthy. But there were some significant weaknesses which would help the rise of the Depression. These are the long-term causes, the things that were happening during the whole of the 1920s. The Great Depression began in 1929 and was the time that the US economy went down. The reasons for this can be divided into long-term and short-term causes. The long-term causes combine to form a cycle of depression, and that's what we have here, the cycle of depression. Reduced demand for consumer goods meant that factories had to make less goods. They had to produce less goods. When the factories made less, they needed less workers, so the unemployment increased. This meant that less people had money to spend on luxury items like cars, radios, etc. And so there was less demand. And so again, there was less demand, so less things were made. And this became a whole cycle that went round again and again and again. Pause the video now, copy down this summary, and also copy down this cycle of depression. In your textbook, there are three main factors, three main long-term causes of the depression. The first one was overproduction. Mass production methods were great for producing large quantities of items. That assembly line, remember, made it easy to produce many things very quickly, and that lowered the cost. But the market quickly became saturated. Saturated means they cannot take any more. So think about you knock over your water, you put your t-shirt in, and you try to mop up the water with your t-shirt. But there's only so much water that your t-shirt can take. Eventually, it will stop. This is what happened to the market, the people that were buying goods. Like with the farmers, demand for the products fell. Now, like with the farmers, I mean, when the farmers produced more food, there wasn't enough market, there weren't enough customers to buy all of the food. So the price of the crops decreased. While demand for the products also fell. Once people bought their car, their radio, they did not need a second car or a second radio. So factories were forced to produce fewer goods. And this meant reducing the size of their workforce. So less people could afford consumer goods, and so a new cycle began. This is what you need to be copying down in your books. The first factor is overproduction. Factories were just making too much, and they had a difficult time selling. Supply and demand shows that when supply is too high, the prices will fall. The companies are going to compete with each other for the customer, so they have to reduce the price. This meant that factories had to make less. Pause the video and copy down. The second factor was an unequal distribution of wealth. The fall in demand was also a result of an unequal distribution of wealth. Although many Americans wanted to buy consumer goods, millions of Americans could not afford to buy them. Now, the population of America was very high, but millions of people in America did not have enough money to buy a car or a radio or anything else like that. In 1928, many American families only just had enough money to feed themselves and pay for the necessities like rent and utilities. Utilities means water, electricity. Even during the boom years of the 1920s, more than half of Americans were living below the poverty line. So there are two types of things that people buy: necessities and luxuries. Necessities are things that people cannot do without. You must pay for rent. You must live somewhere. You must buy food. You must have your electric and water. These are necessities. Luxuries are the things that make your life nicer, but you don't need to buy them. So cars, radios, they can make life nicer for Americans, but they did not need to buy them. And because half the population were in poverty, half the population could never buy the things that were made in America. Here's the summary to copy down. The unequal distribution of wealth was the second factor. Many people in America were poor. They never got rich, so they could never share in the prosperity. And this links to the previous idea of overproduction. Because millions of people were poor, the market for selling the goods was small. If the companies had shared more profits to the workers, then the workers would have had more money to buy things. But because the owners of the companies were quite stingy, they didn't want to pay high salaries, then the workers that were making the radios could not really afford to buy the radio. So the size of the population who could buy these things was always going to be small. The third long-term cause was the tariff policy. Remember, tariff means tax, so the tax policy. One way of selling surplus extra goods was to find overseas markets. So companies in America could try to sell to Europe, to Japan, to China, to Korea, to Australia. They could try and sell their radios and their cars in overseas countries. However, the United States government had raised the taxes, the tariffs, on foreign goods being sold into America. Remember, this was the idea of protecting the American factories. By making it more expensive for other countries to sell their goods in America, American factories were more likely to be able to sell to American people. But the result was that foreign governments wanted to do the same with American goods. And so anything coming from America into Europe or Japan or Korea also had a high tariff. That meant that American businessmen found it very difficult to sell their goods abroad. They had to focus on the American customers. And once the American customers had bought their car and bought their radio, there were very few people left to sell the things to. So the third main point and the summary that you need to copy down is the third factor was the tariff policy. American charged taxes, tariffs on foreign goods. So foreign countries charged taxes on American goods. This meant that US products were too expensive in other countries. And this again links to that first point. The market for the US product was too small. So factories had to make less. So less people had jobs, so less people had money, so there was less demand. By 1929, production in American factories was slowing down because they could not sell everything that they were making. This had been a long-term factor, but in 1929, it was becoming a very big problem for American companies. Now, your homework is to answer these questions in lesson 1 of unit 2. How did people view the economy during the 1920s and why? What does overproduction mean? Why did it happen? What were the effects? Describe the different social conditions of families in the 1920s. What was the tariff policy? And how did the tariff policy harm American businesses who exported goods? Answer these questions today, and tomorrow we will look at tomorrow or Friday we will look at short-term causes of the Depression.